Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture. My name is Will Barbie, and I am the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale. And it is a true pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture with Dr. Bjorn Lomborg entitled Climate Change is Not an Emergency, featuring a lecture and audience Q&A. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to all students, admitted students at Yale visiting for Bulldog Days. As a professor of mine once said, once you get to Yale, you'll never want to leave. So welcome, and I hope your stay has been as enjoyable as mine has been. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We've hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious, conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow at our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. And before I introduce Dr. Lomborg, I would also like to express a word of gratitude to Bob Kreitler, whose generous support made this afternoon's event possible. And it is now my great honor to introduce our guest. Dr. Bjorn Lomborg is a Danish political scientist, author, and globally recognized thought leader. He's the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, a think tank that collaborates with more than 300 of the world's leading economists, including 7 Nobel laureates, to identify the most effective solutions to the world's greatest challenges. Lomborg gained international acclaim for his best-selling book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, which sparked widespread debate on environmental priorities. His subsequent works, including Cool It and False Alarm, continue to challenge conventional approaches to climate change and advocate for data-driven, cost-effective solutions. Named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people, Lomborg is a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Over the years, he's been a frequent contributor to major media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Fox, and others. His work emphasizes the importance of prioritizing global efforts to maximize impact, from combating poverty and disease to addressing climate and education challenges. He summarizes these ideas in his 2023 book, Best Things First, which both The Economist and the Financial Times named one of their best books in economics that year. Bjorn Lomborg's insights inspire policymakers, academics, and the public to rethink strategies for a sustainable future. Please join me in welcoming Bjorn Lomborg to the Buckley Institute and to Yale.
Hey, Will. Thank you. Don't believe everything he said. But thank you. It's great to be here. And I've been asked to basically tell you about climate change in just 30 minutes. So obviously there's no way I'm going to be able to do justice to all of these arguments. I'm going to try to sort of set out the general tenor of the arguments, and then I'm sure in the next half hour we'll be able to get back to some of the questions. I'm sorry I can't do everything, but I want to at least give you as much as I can. So if you just notice, I understand that there's some people who are very annoyed that I said it's not an emergency. I am saying it's a problem, but it's just one of many problems that we need to fix in the 21st century. And that's really the question that I keep coming back to, because we have a very different understanding. Most people around the world believe this is the end of the world. A new survey from OECD, so all the rich countries in the world, told us that 60% of all people, of all adults, believe that unmitigated climate change is likely or very likely to lead to the end of mankind, that we're going to go extinct because of climate change. And that's just silly. That's just simply wrong. That's not what the UN Climate Panel tells us. It's not what the IPCC tells us. It tells us there's a real problem called climate change, but it's not the end of the world. And it matters, because if you think climate change is this overwhelming end of the world, if this is a meteor hurtling towards Earth, then obviously, if that's going to eradicate everything you love, that is the only thing you should be concerned about. But the reality is climate change is one of the many problems that we need to fix, and that's what I want to show you here today. So yes, climate change or global warming, it's real, it's man-made, but it's often also dramatically exaggerated. I'm just going to show you, so we could go into a lot of these different things. I'm sure some of the questions afterwards will be, but let me just show you one thing. So on wildfire, you constantly hear this is the end of the world. We hear all this about all the fires that are consuming the world. And remember, this picture is one that you want to click on, right? This is the kind of thing that you see in the media and you think, oh, wow, this is really bad. Well, I need to look at that. I need to see what it is. And of course, that's one of the reasons why you keep seeing it, because it sells. Bad news sells. But what is the reality? So I'm a data guy. I want to show you what is actually the data telling us. And if we look at the amount of fire that we've seen, so because climate models actually need to incorporate how much of the world is burning, because that emits CO2, we actually have reasonably good estimates from 1900 until today. But this is still a historical estimate. But actually, of the total world burning, it used to be that about 4.2% of the Earth's surface burnt every year, and now it's down to about 3% or thereabout. It's not, contrary to, I think, what many would assume, certainly when you hear the news, it's not getting worse and worse. It's actually gotten better. But since the late 1990s, we've had satellites circling the Earth 24/7 and telling us how much is burning. And so we're very sure of the last 25 years or so, and what it shows is very clearly a dramatic decline in the amount of burnt area every year. This is not just forest, this is everywhere in the world, right? And so what this tells you, given the world is the same size, or the land mass is the same size, this is just a dramatic drop. And in the future, then if you look out in the future, you would imagine, well, certainly it's going to get a lot worse. No. Because, to a very large extent, because of adaptation, we've actually seen a decline, even if we do no climate policy. If we do climate policy, we will see an even larger decline. But the important point here is to recognize that climate change is not something that suddenly makes everything go out of whack. It means that, yes, because people generally adapt, it will get less bad over time. But if we do climate policy, we can actually make it even less bad, which is a nice thing, but it's a very different thing from avoiding the meteor hitting us and we're all going to evaporate, right? But of course, the sense here is then, if you see this kind of thing, you say, but what about Los Angeles or something like that, right? Well, actually, you might have seen this. This is a new study that came out this year by Patrick Brown that actually looked at what happens if we look at today. They run, and this is just one metric of today, in Los Angeles, and say, then you get some sort of expression of how bad is it for fire. They use potential fire heat as the measurement. And then they say, what would have happened had everything been the same if we run Los Angeles again, but in 2050, when there's more heat, when the world has heated up. And then what you show is, if we don't do very much, you will get 7.2% more fire heat. So clearly, there's something true to this, that because of climate change, all other things equal, you will get a worse outcome. But the important bit here is also to remember, if we dramatically reduce emissions by 2050, if we get everybody along, not just the US, but also Europe and everybody else, but crucially also China and India and Africa and everyone else on board reducing emissions dramatically, then instead of 7.2% more, we can just get it down to 5.5% more. That's not a terribly great outcome. But what he then also crucially does is he says, what if we instead made sensible policies, like for instance, reducing the fuel wood available, so make sure that we clear up, that we have prescribed fires, that we have better forest management. If you do that, you can make sure that there's 15.4% less fire in Los Angeles by 2050. And I think this is one of the crucial bits. There is some real point in saying, yes, we will probably see a little more fire because of climate change. But it's not predominantly through climate policy that we'll be able to do anything about it. It is through simple and smart adaptation measures that'll make a huge difference. So again, let's make sure that we worry about the right things and that we focus on the right things. And that's really what my conversation here today is about. If we think smarter about this, we're more likely to actually be able to make good decisions. So let me just get right to it. What is it that makes it so, our sort of understanding of climate change get it so wrong? Why is it that we all think the world is getting to hell in a handbasket? And I think to a very large extent it's because we forget that people adapt. That's why fire has gone down over the last century and is likely to go down this century as well. It's not because there's no climate change, but it's because most people don't want fire. And so we make sure that we make our societies such that we have less fire. And we fail to remember that in many different kinds of ways. Let me just show you, I think, the most important way, namely how many people die from climate-related disasters. So I'm going to show you for floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires, where we have good data for at least 100 years from the International Disaster Database. And again, the reason why I focus on death is because that's very easy to show. It's very unlikely that people have forgotten really big deaths, whereas people affected is much, much harder and much more elastic. If we notice how many people die, of course, it's very variable year to year. So I'm going to do an average and say, what did it look like 100 years ago? In the 1920s, how many people died from floods, drought, storms, and wildfires? Turns out that about 500,000 people died each and every year. Now, if you listen to sort of the rhetoric around climate change, you would imagine this has gone up dramatically since then. It's just gotten worse and worse. And you'd be totally, totally wrong. This is the actual numbers instead. What we've seen is a dramatic drop. So that today, about 10,000 people die each year, a reduction of 98% over the last 100 years. Again, this has nothing to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that we've adapted, that we've gotten better technological, we can predict much more, we have much better ability to get information out, and obviously because people are richer, they're also better able to protect themselves and get away if they need to do so. This is fundamentally a question of adaptation. It could be, and it's possibly not unreasonable to assume, that there's a tiny climate signal down below that's actually going up. But it's totally, totally swamped by the fact that we're much better able to adapt. And this is important because it, again, underscores the point. This is not the end of the world. This is simply not the end of the world. This is a question of a world that's much, much better. But if we did something about climate change, it possibly could be even better. But it's a very different conversation than the one that we have right now. Oh my God, the world is ending. This is the end of it if we don't do something. What we need to recognize, and I think a lot of us forget, the world used to be terrible, and now it's much better. If you look at this is New York Herald from 1921 this is a full page death from millions in 1921 record heat wave. This is the kind of thing you'd imagine you'd read about today. But if you read about it today, it would not be millions. It'd be hundreds of people dying in India or something like that. Remember, the millions were not mainly dying from the heat itself. They died from the fact that the harvests failed and so on. But the point is, we've forgotten how terrible it used to be. And now it's much, much better because we have adapted, because we're richer, because we have more technology. We need to remember this. And this, of course, puts us in a mindset where we no longer say, oh my God, the world is ending. But we can start thinking about, okay, it's a problem. How do we fix it compared to all the other problems in the world? So fundamentally, my point is climate change is not the end of the world. It's a problem. And so we really need to get to a simple and smarter place of thinking about it. I'm going to make an argument that's really, really hard, which is one of the reasons why I'm not winning this conversation. But I'm going to make the argument that climate change is not the end of the world. It is a problem that makes the world slightly less better off. You see why that's not going to catch on anytime soon, right? But it's the right way to think about it. Let me give you an example. So look at hunger deaths. We know that hunger deaths have come down dramatically. Almost all hunger deaths are induced in under 5, so very young kids around the world. If you look at the global burden of disease, we used to have like 6.5 million kids dying from hunger in 1990. Today, that number is down to about 2.5 million. This is a fantastically much better world, but obviously still an incredibly terrible world where 2.5 million kids die each and every year from lack of food. The World Health Organization then took a look and said, what will this look like if we had a world without any climate change? Then this is what they find. Without climate change, it'll keep dropping, and by mid-century, it'll be down to about 500,000 kids dying each and every year. It's a much better world, but still a world with a huge issue, right? In 2050, still 500,000 kids die unnecessarily so. But then they said, if we have climate change, how much worse will it be? And it turns out this is what they found. It'll be about 100,000 more people dying. Now, a lot of people were arguing, and this is the only thing that it came out in the press release, was 100,000 kids are going to die because of climate change. Every year. And technically that's true, but I would argue that is a very misleading understanding of what it says up here, because what it really shows is climate change, even with climate change, the world is going to get much, much better. We're going to have fewer and fewer kids dying from hunger, but slightly slower. It is a real problem. I'd rather be in the world with no climate change than one with climate change, but it's not such that climate change has suddenly made the world unlivable. It's simply slowed down progress. This is a very different concept, and we really need to get to grips with that if we're going to make an understanding of what is the real impact. Well, what is the real impact? So a lot of climate economists have spent a lot of their time trying to investigate all the different ways that climate change has an impact. So climate change obviously works, as we just looked at, with nutrition, but it also works on sea level rise, it works on flooding, it works on more heavy precipitation, it works with more heat deaths, actually fewer cold deaths, and so on. There's lots of different ways. If you try to estimate all of these ways, there are 2 big new papers out last year from Nordhaus, the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize, and one of the most quoted climate economists, Richard Tall. They both tried to take a look at all of the studies that are out there and say, of all these studies, what is the impact? So what they did, and I'm just going to show you one of them. This is from Richard Tall. If you take the temperature out here, and I'm sorry, everybody just does this in centigrades. It works well in the rest of the world, but in the US, you're just like, what? It's, double it, and then it's roughly in Fahrenheit, right? So the more temperature out here, and then the impact in terms of economics. So fundamentally, how much worse off will you be? How much less wealthy will you feel? That's roughly what this means down this. And as you can see, it mostly goes into the negative territory. And what they find is obviously there's a lot of different estimates here, but roughly they follow this line. So the worse, the more temperature, the worse it gets. So let's just take a look at, right now we think the world will probably be at about 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And that's equivalent in this point here to a reduction of 1.9% of GDP. So it'll mean that we will feel 1.9% less well off than we otherwise would have been. Now, Nordhaus finds, and again, I'm not showing you that, he has a lot of the same studies, but he gives them different weights, so he finds it's about 3.1. Let's just roughly say this means the world will be somewhere between 2 and 3% less well off than it otherwise would have been. This is clear that climate change is a real problem. 2 to 3% is a significant problem. It's a lot of $1 trillion if you put it into to actual dollar amounts. But it also underscores the very important point that 2 to 3% is just not an existential crisis for mankind. This is not the end of the world. It's a problem. Just to give you one sense of proportion, the UN estimate the average person, so this is one of their scenarios. Obviously, we don't know what the world is going to look like in 2100, but this is typically seen as the middle of the road scenario. That's what they call it. The most likely scenario, if you will. By the end of the century, the average person in the world will be 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's a fantastic outcome. It doesn't mean that you guys are going to be 450% as rich. In rich world, you might be 2, maybe 2.5 times richer. In many parts of the poor part of the world, so in Africa and elsewhere, they might be 9, 10, 12 times as rich. That's a phenomenal world. We'll be much better off by the end of the century, 450%. But remember, that's without taking into account climate change, which is going to cost 2 to 3%. So the reality is, if you actually look at it, instead of being 450% as rich, we're only going to be 435 to 440% as rich. And that again underscores my point, that we think this is the end of the world. That's how it's being put in front of us. But the reality is, no, it means we'll be slightly less, much better off by the end of the century. It's a problem. I would much rather have a world where we're 450% as rich per person than one where we're only 435% as rich. But it shouldn't take away from the fact that that's still a pretty darn good world. It's just not quite as good as it could have been. And that, of course, underscores the fundamental point of saying, if you start thinking about what it is that climate economists is telling us, climate change costs 2 to 3% by the end of the century. It also emphasizes, if you can find a solution that costs, say, 1% of GDP and fixes most of the 2 to 3% problem, that's a phenomenal opportunity. Cost 1%, gives you 2 to 3% back. That's great. It is not such a great idea if you find something that's going to cost us 10% of our GDP and only cuts a little bit of the 2 to 3% problem. That's a really bad deal. And unfortunately, it's the latter that we're typically seeing right now in most of our conversations about how do we fix climate change. And so my real point here is to recognize, first of all, that our current policies are not working, and then I'll get to what I think we should be doing instead. So if you look at our efforts to go green, they have real and significant costs. If you look at the US, so the US has gone somewhat greener over the last 30 years, but you also use all of the costs are funded by taxpayers, so it's essentially taxpayer, so it doesn't show up in your electricity bills, which is why the US, if you look at the US over time, the US price of electricity, this is the weighted average of industrial cost, which is typically on all countries much lower than the household cost, but this is the average cost of all kilowatt hours in the US sold. And obviously inflation adjusted, it's remained very, very stable over time. But if you look at some other countries, if you looked at Germany, and I could show you a lot of other ones, I'm just going to show you one, namely the UK, which has put climate change in the center of their policies. You've seen a very different thing. So we saw for the last century, over the 20th century, cost of electricity came down dramatically, as most things did, because we just got better at doing them. And that's what you see in the beginning here for the UK. It was at its lowest cost, and this is comparable with the US UK exchange rate. It was at 11.6 pence per kilowatt hour in 2003. And since then, the cost has tripled. Now, obviously, we can have some quibbles about, we only have data, full data till 2023. It's come down somewhat in 2024. You could also argue certainly some of these increases because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Part of the reason why that's a big deal in Europe is also because we haven't been fracking like the US has. There's a whole conversation out there that we can have on this. But what it shows you is that if you actually have policies that are climate related, you end up with very, very much higher cost. And I'll show you this in a more simple way. If you look at how many % of solar and wind you have in your electricity production, and then you map it out on how much does it cost. So the last year that we have this good data for internationally, where we have this for 69 nations across the world, is for 2022. But the pattern looks similar in 2019, when before COVID and before Ukraine war. And what you see here is very clearly you can have very low electricity prices down here. Obviously, these are subsidized. This is Kyrgyzstan. There's no way they can produce it this low. This is subsidized, right? But Indonesia gets almost no solar and wind and has a cost of about 8 cents per kilowatt hour. You have India, China, you have the US a little higher up, and then you have the EU up here much, much higher, basically because, yes, we have more solar and wind, but we also have much, much more regulation. And you can see some of the big countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Greece, and obviously, I'm sorry to say, my native Denmark up here leading the way. We're incredibly green, but we're also incredibly expensive. The real takeaway here is obviously you can do this in many ways, and you can do it smarter or more stupid, but the takeaway is that there are no places on the planet where you have lots of green energy that's also cheap. You can have cheap energy or you can have lots of green energy, but you can't have both. Sorry, I should have said electricity in both of those cases. What that really shows us is currently we're being told that that solar and wind is incredibly cheap, but what we see from the evidence is, no, it actually gets more and more costly. Exactly how costly? Obviously depends on how smart you are and also where you're placed and how good you are at doing this, and obviously you don't want solar in Denmark or Norway, and you want a lot more solar in the south, and possibly in India you can do it even cheaper. All that stuff is true, but fundamentally, this is not making electricity cheaper. If anything, it's making it much, much more expensive. And so what we need to recognize is that we're nowhere near this trajectory of, oh, we're going to have this all fixed anytime soon. If you look at how much of the global energy supply, so not just electricity, but all energy comes from fossil fuels, it has been slightly declining since 1971, which is when the International Energy Agency starts its statistics. But it's nowhere near this sort of suggested, oh, we're going to get to zero in 2050. No, we're not. If you look at some of the fastest trend, we'll get to zero in 4 centuries from now. If you look across the whole data series, we'll get to zero in like 9 centuries from now. We're nowhere near getting here. So my point is that we're both being told this is the end of the world, which is just not true, it's a problem. And we're also being told that, oh, but climate change is cheap and easy, and it'll make us richer, it'll make for very green, cheap energy with solar, and we'll just all stop using fossil fuels. Well, that's not what the data at all suggests. And that's why I think we really need to have a better and more sensible conversation about, so what should we do? So I think if there's one point that climate economics has sort of brought to fore is to say the following. Climate change means real and costly damages. That's absolutely true. This is what you hear every day. This is what you read in New York Times and Washington Post, whatever newspaper you read. This is the story that you are constantly told. Climate change is going to be terrible. It's going to have a lot of cost. Much of this is true. But what you also need to remember is climate policy also mean large economic damages. We rarely hear that, but you really do need to hear it, because if we're, as a society, going to make decisions on what we should do, we're the only ones who have to pay. We both have to pay the climate damages, but we also have to pay the climate policy damages. So what William Nordhaus actually got his Nobel Prize for was to say, well, if that's true, we should find the optimum of adding those two together. Since we're going to pay for both of them, we need to find the smallest added number. How do we find the smallest cost of both climate damages and climate policy damages? We rarely have that conversation, but we should. We really, really should. And I think that's one of the points that if we start sort of saying, oh, this is not the end of the world, this is a problem, we can get people much better along to say, all right, so how do we do that? What is the right and optimal way of doing that? And that is a real and sensible conversation. I don't think anyone has the full and complete answer to that, but we can suddenly be much smarter in thinking about what should be the answer to that. It also means we need to recognize some of the things that we're all promising ourselves, like go net zero by 2050, is just simply silly and not going to happen. So it's interesting to know that going net zero by 2050, which is something that almost all politicians have gone on about and almost everyone in the rich world certainly have committed to, we've never actually had a cost and benefit estimate made, which is kind of surprising because it's by far the biggest cost that any public commitment ever made in the history of mankind. So the second costliest thing was probably the Versailles Treaty back ending the First World War. Had Germany actually paid all the stuff that it was supposed to pay, that would have cost in today's dollars about $500 billion. That's a lot of money. That's one of the reasons why they didn't pay it. But the reality is net zero will probably cost us in the order of 1,000 to 2,000 times more than that. So surely, a reasonable policy conversation would say, well, what's the cost? What's the benefit? So Richard Mendelsohn from Yale University, actually gathered a lot of economists to try to answer this. This is the first. So McKinsey has also tried to make an estimate, but this was just a cost estimate. It wasn't actually a cost and benefit estimate. It wasn't a full economy estimate. So this is really the first time they tried to estimate what's the full cost, what's the full benefit. Most of the economists ended up checking out. So what I'm going to show you is what they ended up with, which was 1 benefit estimate and 3 cost estimates. So this is by no means the end of the conversation, but the difference in cost sort of shows that we probably need to be smarter about this. And this is also undiscounted, so it's not the real way to look at this, but it's very hard for most people to understand the discounted, and will actually make my argument stronger because all the costs come up front and the benefits come far down the line. So I'm just going to show you the average undiscounted cost over the century. So the benefit of achieving net zero is significant. What the numbers find is that on average, this would mean a benefit for humankind of $4.5 trillion a year. That's a significant amount of money. In today's, global GDP now is about $100 trillion. That's 4.5%. Obviously, we'll be rich over the century, so it'll be less than that. But it's, that's a lot of money. This first of all shows global warming is real. It is a man-made problem. It is something that we should be concerned about. And if we could get the world to net zero by 2050, all the world, that would actually have a substantial benefit. But the cost of this would be much, much higher. They found, on average, the cost over the 21st century would be about $27 trillion, or about 7 times higher. Every year throughout the 21st century, the costs vastly outweigh the benefits. Now, they didn't look into the 22nd century, and obviously, in a perfect world, we should have done that, and it seems reasonable to assume that eventually the benefits will outweigh the costs somewhere into the 22nd century. But the fundamental point here is to say that we're talking about having everyone in the world today and in the next, 75 years or so, buy into a situation where we're going to be spending much, much more money each and every year than the benefits that we're going to confer the world. This is probably impossible to achieve. This is certainly impossible to achieve in a democratic setting. You can surely make sure that people pay this for, say, 5 or 10 or 15 years, but eventually politicians come around and say, why don't we just stop with all that crap? You guys have a president doing that right now, but it seems reasonable that that would happen in a lot of other countries as well, eventually. It is just hard to sustain this over decades and decades and across all nations. And of course, while you might be able to do this in rich, well-meaning societies like here, or maybe even the US and Denmark, other places, it's much harder to imagine that we could do this in China, India, and Africa. So the real point here is to say, we need to recognize that our current policy is just not going to cut it. So what should we do? Well, what is the smart climate policy? And then I'll shut up, and then we can have a good conversation about this. I'm just going to make 4 simple points, because this is one of the things that we worked out on with, so we did a full prioritization with 50 of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, trying to find out what are the smart things to do. So I think these are the 4 things we need to recognize. The first one is we need to tell it as it is. It's very unlikely that we're going to succeed in making good climate policy by scaring everyone witless. We need to tell people it is a problem. It's not the end of the world. It's an issue that makes the world get better slightly slower rather than this meteor that's hurtling towards Earth and extinguishing everyone. So first of all, tell it as it is. Let's make sure that we get the messaging right. Climate is a problem, not the end of the world. The only realistic solution to climate change is innovation. Remember, innovation is how we fix most problems in the world. We did not fix problems in the world by telling everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind being poorer and colder and less comfortable, and would you mind doing that for decades on end? And would you mind to get everybody else in the world along with that? That's just not going to work. What is going to work is if we could innovate green future energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we'd be done. Everyone would switch. Just for a second, imagine with me that fourth generation nuclear could be made cheaper than everything else we have. I'm not sure that's true, but let's just think about that for a second. So fourth generation, those small modular nuclear reactors, imagine they would be incredibly safe and very, very cheap. We wouldn't have to convince everyone to switch to these small modular nuclear reactors. Everyone would just buy them because they were cheaper. The point here is if you innovate something that's very cheap and everyone wants, you're done. Think about it. When we had a problem in the 1950s in Los Angeles where there was a huge amount of air pollution, mostly from cars, and because of the unique geography of Los Angeles, the solution was not to tell everyone in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, could you walk instead? That would never work. What did work was we innovated the catalytic converter. It costs a couple $100. You put it on the tailpipe, and then basically you can drive as long as you want and pollute very, very little. That works. And that was what worked, and that's basically why Los Angeles is a lot cleaner. It didn't fix all problems. If you go to Los Angeles, there's still lots of other problems, right? And there's a lot of congestion problems, but fundamentally it fixed most of the air pollution problem. Likewise, if you think about the problem that we had in the 1960s, early 1970s, where we thought we wouldn't be able to feed most of the world. A lot of people were arguing, India is just a basket case, we've just got to let it go and they're all going to die, and that's just sad. But we can't save everyone. The solution was not, as my mom and everyone else very, very few people in here who've lived through that period, but I remember my mom telling you need to finish your food because think of all the poor people who are not getting enough food. The solution was not to have everyone eat a little less and when we would send it to Africa or India. The solution was what was called the Green Revolution. We found a way to dramatically increase yields by having higher yielding varieties, have more pesticides and more fertilizer. That was how we got people much better fed. So for every acre of land, you could now go 2 or 3 times the amount of crop. And that's, of course, why, for instance, India has gone from being a basket case to now being the world's leading rice exporter. They still have lots of other problems. I'm not saying everything's fine, but fundamentally, we solved this through innovation. That's how we're going to solve climate change. We need to dramatically increase investment in green energy R&D. We have not. So on the sidelines of Paris Agreement in France in 2015, there was actually another Paris Agreement. It was called Mission Innovation. Obama was there, the Chinese Prime Minister, Bill Gates, a lot of other people were there to try to say we should actually double spending on green energy R&D. I'm very happy to say we played a really small part in this and tried to push for this. That's how you solve climate change. But because we're so worried about climate change, we focused all of our energy in spending it on solar panels and wind turbines right now because you can show them off, you can say, see, we're doing something. But this is not what is going to solve the problem. This may make us feel a little good about ourselves. It may make Denmark or Connecticut feel like we're part of the solution. But this is not what's going to impact the emissions in the 21st century. That's going to be China, India, and Africa. And we need to convince them, and we're only going to convince them if we get cheap green energy. So innovation is by far the best opportunity. And of course, if we get innovation, if we get cheap green energy, It'll have lots of other benefits as well. One of them is, right now, about 3 million people die from really bad indoor air quality in most of the poor part of the world because they use dung and cardboard and wood and other things that are incredibly polluting inside. About 2 billion people live in huts that are so polluted that they are 10 or 20 times as polluted as the worst outdoor air pollution in Beijing or New Delhi. It's equivalent, according to the World Health Organization, of each one of these more than 2 billion people smoking 2 packs of cigarettes each and every day because it's so polluted. If we could get cheaper air, not only would we, if we get cheaper energy, green energy, it would not just be good for climate, it would also mean that they could actually get electricity so they wouldn't have to be worried about cooking and keeping warm, but they would actually do so with a very clean opportunity. Then we need to adapt, as I pointed out before. Adaptation has fixed a large part of the problems that we worried about. We know that this can fix it. So again, remember when you worry about sea levels rising 3 feet, that's a significant concern. But it's not like we haven't fixed a lot of this in the past. Remember, over the past 150 years, sea levels rose about 1 feet. And most people didn't notice because we know how to fix things. It's going to be worse because of climate change. It's going to go faster because of climate change. But it's something that we can, to a very large extent, adapt to. And we need to remember that we can. It's both important so we don't scare ourselves witless, and also because we need to, while we're also thinking about how we cut carbon emissions, that we need to remember adaptation. And then the last thing is that we need to boost economic growth. We've become so obsessed about this one issue of climate change, which is a real concern, that we're so focused on saying we need to cut carbon emissions that we very often think, especially when we talk to poor nations and say, look, you got to fix your carbon problem, you got to cut your carbon. No, they need to grow, they need to be able to get out of poverty, they need to be able to save their kids from not dying from easily curable infectious diseases and all kinds of other things. And of course, if we get economic growth, it will not just be good for societies, but it'll also mean they will not have all the problems that they have right now, but it'll also mean that they'll become much more resilient to climate problems. One of the obvious things is if a hurricane hits Florida, sure, a few people die and it causes some problems. But the same hurricane hitting Guatemala, it's devastation, lots and lots of thousands of people dying. So there's a real benefit in lifting people out of poverty. So what I would argue is that we really need to get our sense of climate right by focusing on saying, tell it as it is, make sure that we focus on innovation. We should also remember adaptation, and we should remember to get people out of poverty. That's what's going to fix climate change. But we'll only have that conversation if we stop being scared witless. So I hope I at least started that conversation. I'll look very much forward to your questions. And I know that I saw you had your hand up, so I'm sorry. But yeah, if I start talking, we just have all the questions. So please let me have some of your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lomborg. We are going to move into the Q&A portion of our event now. If you have a question, we just ask that you stand up and come to my colleague over here who will have a microphone on the right side of the auditorium and will be able to answer your questions.
So you did get the first question.
I guess it worked out, yeah.
There you go.
So I'm curious if you've got, is this on? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm curious if you've got any statistics on ecological carrying capacity, because I know in some cases climate change can be a symptom of our encroachment on that sustainable threshold. So I was wondering, aside from the tangential statistics about the impact on economy specifically with climate change, are there anything about the overarching problem that could be caused by our encroachment on ecological carrying capacity?
So that's an incredibly broad question. Is there any way you could sort of make it more specific on, is there a specific thing that you worry about?
I'm just curious, I know I've learned in a couple of classes, and there's a threshold where it's, whether it's a keystone species or whether it's a culmination of pollution and emissions, like you were saying, that add up to a deterioration in what the Earth can sustainably recycle. If there's I don't know, I wouldn't per se know exactly what the
Okay.
specifics would be.
So I'm going to answer part of your question. So again, nobody knows, or I think nobody knows everything about climate in every sort of dimension, and I certainly don't pretend I know all of this. So my understanding of these sort of threshold arguments is that they're in some ways very artificial. You know, you can't have more nitrogen than this, or you can't have more CO2 than this. And of course, that's not true in any sort of real world experience. You know, it's just like when all politicians will tell you, well, we should have full employment. Everybody should have a job if they want to. Yes, but that's not how the world works. And you know, you can say these things, but the reality is we make trade-offs on a lot of different points. So your question to me is more sort of in the vein of saying, if I worry about some of these other things, say, for instance, species loss, that's a real concern. And I think if people get richer, certainly at first, you will actually have more encroachment on wildlife. We certainly see that both in rich countries when we've had all our wars and we just chop down all our forests. And that's likely to happen, certainly to a certain extent, in many poor countries. But also, once you get sufficiently rich, you actually start reforesting because you care about this, because you no longer worry about your kids dying from easily curable infectious diseases. And then you can start thinking about some of these things. So I think you need to have both of these. I don't have a fully formed answer to your question, so I'm sorry, it's going to feel like at least half an answer at best.
That's great. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So my question is, obviously you show the data of like if a country has greater percentage of green energy, then they will cost more. I'm thinking that's more of a correlation graph, right? Would there be like, let's say, hidden variables such as maybe the country that have greater percentage of green energy is because they can't get fuel, and that means they generally have a deficit, or like they can't generate enough energy. That's why the price is high, not really because the green energy is costing a lot of money.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. This is a correlation. So there's a lot of other arguments I could have shown you. So the simple point is to say that people will tell you solar and wind is incredibly cheap, which is true when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. But the problem is it's, in some sense, infinitely costly when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. And so the real question is, and there's been no good estimate of that, what is the actual cost per kilowatt hour? Mostly we just simply ignore it and we just measure it when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And then obviously you get these graphs that show that solar and wind is incredibly effective, and we should all just switch to solar and wind. But then you get the big issue of what are you going to do when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And the real issue here is if you then try to look at how much storage would you need, so there's, as far as I know, only one good period study of how much would it take to keep the US running if you only focused on having solar or only focused on wind. And the answer is you'd need 3 months of batteries or backup power. And right now the US has about 10 minutes or so. So you need an enormous amount more. And at current cost, that would cost about a third of the US GDP every year. And remember, you'd have to redo it every 15 years. So that's just not going to happen. The problem with those kinds of arguments is that they end up being sort of people making one sort of argument at one end and say, oh, it's actually really cheap. There's a guy from Stanford who does that all the time. And me coming up and saying, oh, it's going to be incredibly expensive. That's why I showed you the actual outcome. This is not a model. This is just simply what you end up paying. Now, obviously, a lot of other things go in there. So you need to look at what are all these things, as you point out. Some of these places that are incredibly enamored with solar are also really stupid places to have solar. You don't want to have solar in Germany, or certainly not in Denmark and Sweden. That's mostly just dumb, right? So there's a lot of dumbness in there as well, and I'm not sure how you exactly correct for that. There's also a Ukraine war in there that's hard to take out. That was why I mentioned that the data actually looks the same in 2019. But I think it's a more convincing argument, but we don't have sort of the killer argument. So I wanted to show you one graph as one way of looking at it, but it's not the definitive answer.
Hey, this is sort of an open-ended question, but I was curious to know if you think there's potential for climate change to become an emergency, and if so, are there any indicators that make a distinction between when climate change is a problem and when it's like, quote unquote, the end of the world?
Yes. So yes, there's certainly, so I worked with Thomas Schelling, who's one of our Nobel laureates. He's unfortunately passed now, but one of his arguments was, it's ridiculous how the UN climate panel for 20 years has been focused on the central outcome, which is the one that shows, yeah, it's a problem. What they should have looked at is these outliers, the far tails. What happens in exclusive outcomes that are really bad? Because that's what really would define whether we should do something much more. So if sea levels doesn't rise 3 feet, but they rise, say, 20 feet, sorry, I can't really do that in feet, but 5 meters, 7 meters, all of Greenland melts, that kind of thing, that would be really bad. And some people have actually tried to look at it. It would be bad. It would not by any means be the end of civilization, but it would be a lot more costly. What if many of these kind of things happen? That would be really, really bad. And I think we should be more honest about that there are some outliers that potentially could change this, this conversation. Now, obviously, me being the kind of guy that makes this argument, I also think we need to take a couple of steps back. There's a lot of people who will say, well, what about tipping points? That should make us much more worried, and so we should spend a lot more money on climate change. Actually, there's a whole conversation between Nordhaus, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in climate economics, and fat tail guy, what was his name? Sorry? What? Yeah, he was from Harvard. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, I'll get it afterwards. But he was saying, fundamentally, if there's a fat tail, that is, if integrate and it gets to infinity, it means that we should spend all of our money on climate, right? And that sort of makes theoretical sense. But then Nordhaus was arguing, but surely this is not the only thing that has a risk of going wrong, right? I mean, North Korea comes to mind, but what about gray goo? The idea that automata are going to make the whole world into small automatas, and we're all going to dissolve into gray goo. What about AI? There are lots of other things that we could potentially worry about, and they're all going to scream and say, we could potentially make the end of the world, so give us all your money. You can't have a situation where everybody's saying, we should give you all your money to this problem and to this problem and this problem. One of the things we should recognize is the best way to become resilient to a lot of these things is by making sure that people get out of poverty, because we know poverty is one of the things that make you vulnerable to almost all kinds of things, and get lots and lots of knowledge. Remember, what we've done what our forefathers did for us was they didn't sit down and think, oh, what are they going to worry about? Oh, we should cut carbon emissions. They basically said, gung-ho and get rich, but leave our kids with more knowledge and more resources, and then they'll have to fend for themselves. I'm not saying that's a perfect strategy, but it's certainly what we've done in the past, and it's probably the best way to fix many of these problems. So there is a study that looked at all of these tipping points. So, for instance, the Gulf Stream changing, that's a very European kind of thing because it would affect us. But, some of these other things, Greenland melting, that kind of thing. So Nordhaus actually did an estimate of Greenland melting, and because it's going to take so long for Greenland to melt, even, sort of in the highest possible case, it just doesn't make very much difference. But it does make a little difference in saying you should care marginally more about climate change. But it's not that this is suddenly, changes the whole worldview. We should look into this, and if there is a really, really scary thing that we've somehow missed, that could change the calculation. But so far, it seems to indicate you should do something more about climate change, but not all that much more.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Mr. Lomborg. Thank you for being with us. I'm Daniel, a tech policy fellow with the Foundation for American Innovation. I have a question about regulation. So I'm noticing regulation is not something, especially in developed countries, is not something that you've discussed so much in the presentation, but something that I think, to be clear, weighs in favor of kind of your thesis that there are certain targeted things that we ought to be doing. And so my question is, how do you see kind of regulation, and in particular, rolling back environmental regulation or trying to make them more efficient? How do you see this weighing into the kind of portfolio of tools that you see being optimal? And in particular, for instance, in the scatter plot of percent renewables and price per kilowatt hour, it seems like things like NEPA and CEQA and NIMBYism, right, are a big confound in that, especially in the developed countries. So how do you think about that?
So I'm not, again, I come from Europe. We're used to a lot more regulation than you guys. So I'm not necessarily against regulation, but you need to have that conversation of constantly realizing, look, regulation can be good, but it also has costs, and you need to weigh those two, and we often forget that. And forgetting it means that we end up doing really dumb stuff. So on regulation, I would argue that probably the biggest challenge here is on nuclear regulation. We've certainly, remember, back in the 1950s, we were told that nuclear is going to be too cheap to meter, kind of thing. It's just going to, we had this idea that, oh, it was going to power the entire future and nuclear, and then we would just be good to go. Instead, what happened was nuclear just got more and more expensive, and a very large part of that is because of regulation. We felt like, oh my goodness, this is terrible, this is really dangerous, we need to regulate it. And so we ended up making every nuclear power plant into this opera house. It had all the regulations just for this little place, just for this specific place, right? And that's why, costs shot into the stratosphere. What we need to do is to get type of regulations, and that's why fourth generation is arguing that they could be a lot cheaper. I'm not saying they're going to be, because it might go wrong, but if we could type regulate it and then say this nuclear reactor is regulated on the type, and then you produce thousands or tens of thousands of it, it seems likely that we could get them to be much, much cheaper. So we need to recognize that regulation is a large part of why this has a huge cost. Regulation can be good, because we need some regulation. That I'd like to know that everybody agrees that we drive on the right side of the road, sort of thing, or in England on the left side, but that we all agree to that. But it has really a lot of benefits if we do these things, but we also need to remember what are their costs, and certainly for nuclear, that's one of the big costs. I hope that was part of the answer. I'm sorry, there's a whole lecture there. Thanks.
And this will be the last question.
Yeah, so there was this chart about if policies were implemented to try to reach net zero by 2050, the cost would be around 26 trillion. I was wondering how that accounted for like more qualitative factors like death, like human death. Like, how do you quantify that into like a number?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure everyone heard it. How do you quantify deaths and all these things that are going to happen? That is what climate economics have tried to do for a very long time, and it's not a simple issue. Actually, what we think is that you'll see more heat deaths, but you'll also see fewer cold deaths. I didn't show you that at all. You need to take all these things into account. The bigger part of the cost actually comes from the fact that you need to heat less, but you need to cool a lot more. And because most people live in places where you need to cool more than they live in places where you can heat less, the total cost end up being much higher. But there are costs to lives. We've done, climate economics and value economics in general have done a lot of work on trying to estimate how do you value that. I'm not saying this is perfect, by no means. I think they've done a reasonable estimate of this, but you need to dig into all of that. It's not going to fundamentally change the outcome because they're just so different. And I would also argue a lot of the costs are vastly underestimated because we're assuming that politicians will do this reasonably smartly. They're not assuming amazingly smart, which would be ridiculous. But even reasonably smart is probably too much for most politicians across the world. And that's certainly not what we've seen happen. So the cost could easily also vastly escalate. I wasn't saying it to say, oh, see, it's 4.5 and 26.8 trillion. Obviously, that's not the right number. It's somewhere around there, and I think it's much more sort of an order of magnitude argument that we tend to think that these have fairly small cost and huge benefits, but the actual truth is they probably have very high cost and reasonably decent benefits, but probably not the kind of ones that would make you want to do this right now in that order. Thanks.
Well, Dr. Lomborg, thank you very much for such an interesting talk. This does officially conclude our program for today. We apologize that we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but Dr. Lomborg will be here for another 10 minutes or so at the front if you'd like to ask him a question. But again, please join me in thanking Dr. Lomborg for this lecture.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Hey, thank you. Let me just turn off.